Dorothy was having a tough decision with the bank manager when her phone rang, just at the wrong time. She automatically pulled out her cell phone and looked at the number with surprise. Normally she didn't answer to strangers, but today, obeying some sixth sense, she took the call. "Grandma, where are you?" The boy's voice rang with tension. Dorothy said angrily by inertia that she still had a long way to be a grandmother. She thought that the call was a prank and hung up. However, after a minute, she still decided to find out who was pranking her and why, so she called back. "There is not your grandmother here. You have the wrong number. Who gave you it?" asked Dorothy in a more friendly voice. "Grandma's phone was stolen. My dad brought her a new one and I didn't remember the number, but I thought I had dialed the right numbers," replied the boy. "Why can't you call your dad or your mom?" The boy sighed loudly. "His phone is off. Maybe he's in a meeting. And I don't have Mum. She left a long, long time ago. I can only call my dad and Grandma." The woman rubbed her forehead. "What's the emergency? Can you wait and call your dad later?" The boy sobbed. "I've been waiting a long time. Even the bleeding has almost stopped. It just hurts a lot." These words made Dorothy tense. As a surgeon, she had her own stop words, forcing her to act immediately. "What's happened?" The woman's voice became professionally dry. The child was quiet and replied, "The window broke. I hurt myself." Dorothy asked for the child's address. As it turned out, the boy lived near her place. Dropping the car off in her parking spot, she hurried to the address. Trying to keep her hands from shaking, she pressed the 7th floor button in the elevator and rushed to the door. The door swung open almost as soon as she rang it. On the threshold stood a pale, frightened boy of about 5. Brown eyes framed by dark lashes, a striped t-shirt, his arm wrapped in a large bath towel. Dorothy groaned, crouched down, and saw the red-coloured stains. She unwrapped the towel and could hardly stop herself from screaming. From the waist to the shoulder, the skin was deeply cut. She rushed to the table and wrote a short note to the boy's relatives. Grabbing the child's light jacket, she pushed him toward the door. Already taking him to her hospital where she worked, Dorothy found out that the boy's name was Charlie. His grandmother, Mrs. Dunn, had gone to take the clothes to the dry cleaners, and his father, Melvin, was at work until the evening. While the surgeon was stitching up the deep wound, the woman diligently distracted Charlie by telling funny stories, and then she took him to his ward and stayed with him. The boy had fallen asleep, and Dorothy sat, lightly stroking his head, and felt a warm wave of affection for this defenceless creature rise inside her. In the long years of loneliness, it was probably the first time she had ever wanted such a son. Before, her job superseded everything. She was about to leave the patient when a tall, worried man flew into the room. "What do you mean? By what right did you take my child?" He shook a sheet of paper from her notebook. Dorothy caught a glimpse of the boy, who was tossing and turning in his sleep. She drew the man to the window and explained the situation in a half-whisper. His eyes warmed, and she realized he was very attractive. Melvin looked anxiously at his sleeping son, and Dorothy hurried to reassure him. "Everything is fine now. Don't worry." The nurse on duty peeked into the room. "Dr. Evans, there's a patient brought in by ambulance." Dorothy said a short goodbye and hurried to the examination room. The next day was Sunday. She got up late and kept thinking how Charlie was doing. She smiled, remembering Melvin, and waited for his call. After all, grown-up, polite people always call back to thank, to consult, to talk about something, perhaps to ask to go out. Dorothy really wanted him to invite her somewhere, and she began to think enthusiastically about how not to say yes too quickly. Like, she's a doctor and very busy. The woman was so dreamy that she almost missed the call. It was him. Melvin was polite and very pleasant. He thanked her for saving his son and really asked for advice on how to continue to care for the wound. But he didn't invite her anywhere. Dorothy was disappointed and for some reason very offended. She went to the mirror, swiped a comb through her blonde hair. "You're dreaming too much," she said grimly, looking at her reflection. "Go and clean the flat or read a book. It will be more useful. You have to work tomorrow." The boy was discharged on Monday, and she lost sight of him for a long time. The next time, the woman saw the child in the park. That day she stayed late at work and was already rushing home after a difficult shift at dusk, dreaming of a cup of hot tea. Charlie was sitting on a bench and watching people passing by. Dorothy came over and put her hand on his shoulder. "Why are you sitting here so late alone?" The boy looked up at her with tearful eyes. "I'm waiting for my grandmother. She's coming from work through this park." Dorothy wiped his tear-stained face with her palms and asked what was wrong. Charlie was quiet and reluctantly answered, "Hannah hit me because I had broken her perfume. She often hits me." Not understanding who he was talking about, Dorothy became indignant. "Then tell your dad, or do you want me to tell?" Charlie shook his head. "He won't believe me. He never believes. Hannah will be his wife soon. She always says I'm lying." Dorothy squatted down in front of him and examined the long scar on his arm with a professional eye. "As you know, let's wait for your grandmother at my place. It's cold." The boy nodded and asked not to tell his father that he was alone in the park. Already at home, Dorothy called Mrs. Dunn and informed her that Charlie was with her. The next day, Dorothy was in a bad mood. She was rushing on night duty, hurriedly tapping in her heels to the car when she saw them. A tall, beautiful woman came out of the entryway of a neighbouring building, and Melvin hurried after her. When he saw Dorothy, he smiled and came up to her. "Hello. Thanks again for my son." Melvin turned to the woman standing behind him. "Hannah, this is the very doctor who rescued Charlie." Hannah squeezed out a smile and thanked her dryly. Then she reminded Melvin that they were very late, and wiggling her hips, walked to his expensive car. Dorothy smiled at Melvin and got into her vintage small car. The night shift in the hospital was going on without excesses, and the woman even allowed herself to take a nap in her office. She had a strange dream. Completely aloof, Melvin was standing on the edge of a cliff. She realized that he was about to take the fatal step and, struggling out of strength, hurried to interfere. In a last dash, she rushed toward him and grabbed his arm. "Dr. Evans! Hurry to the second operating room. We have a heavy patient after the accident." The nurse's voice brought her out of her slumber. Dorothy quickly rose and suddenly froze, frightened by a cold foreboding. Preparing for surgery, she anxiously peered through the huge viewing window. Holding her hands in sterile gloves up, she hurried to the table. Dorothy looked at the wound on the head, full of splinters, and shifted her gaze downward. Melvin was looking at her with a halted, blank look in his open eyes. Endlessly scraping, cleaning, and stitching, Dorothy bravely endured the entire operation. And when it was over, she cried. She shook in involuntary sobs, unable even to take off the stained robe. Then Dorothy stayed with Melvin until morning, staring intently at the quietly beeping instruments. In the morning, she called Mrs. Dunn. She was waiting for an elderly woman at the door to the intensive care unit when she saw Charlie rushing with all his might. The boy ran up and hugged her tearfully. "Tell me he's not going to die." Dorothy ran her hand through the unruly hair and promised. At this time, his mother came up, and she hugged Dorothy too. "Thank you, Dorothy. You are our guardian angel." The woman wept bitterly and shook her head, and Hannah refused to come. It turns out that yesterday she broke up with Melvin. Do you think he did it on purpose? Dorothy shook her head. No, of course not, because he has you and Charlie. Don't think bad. It's just a tragic accident. Looking through the window of the ward, as an elderly woman adjusts the sheet on her son's chest, Dorothy was in deep thoughtfulness. She shuddered as she was gently touched by the hand. "Will you be my mother?" Charlie looked at her hopefully and pleadingly. The woman stroked his head affectionately and said sadly that it was not for them to decide. After a few critical days, Melvin slowly recovered. Dorothy stayed with him for a long time in the ICU and then visited him daily in the therapy department. The man smiled at her visits and looked forward to them. He was bored if Dorothy, who was busy at work, came to see him only for a minute, and then he was discharged, and she felt a huge emptiness, comparable only to the grief or loss. And most of all, she was upset that he did not even say goodbye. A couple of days later, a faucet in the bathroom broke unexpectedly, and the woman was cleaning up after a water spill. A plumber was about to come, so she was not surprised when the doorbell rang. Dishevelled with a mop in her hands, she rushed to open the door. But instead of a plumber with tools, she saw Melvin with a bouquet of flowers. Flowers put her in a kind of stupor, so she did not immediately understand the meaning of the question addressed to her. Melvin looked at Dorothy and frowned, thought, "Oh, I'm a fool. I rushed to her. I hoped, and she's silent. Why did I assume that she would agree to become my wife? I took professionalism as a demonstration of feelings." Melvin was ready to disappear with shame when Charlie's face peeked out from behind him. "Dorothy, you have promised to me." Dorothy came out of her stupor and smiled. She took the flowers and said with a smile, "It's an unexpected proposal, but very welcome to me."